Now, looking back at the example of Eve and how Eve was created, Eve was given the ability to choose. She could choose to believe what God said and do it, or she could choose to disobey it. And simply because she chose to disobey it is not a reflection on the God that created her. That's the way she was created, is to willingly do what God desired for her to do. Man has the ability to choose between right and wrong. You know, how does an animal know the difference between right and wrong? Well, it doesn't. And what is wrong and what is right in the light of, we're nothing more than educated apes. It's simply a human construct. Yeah, really. Man possesses a conscience. Is a conscience a safe guide? No, it's not. It's not. But what our conscience thinks as to what's right and what's wrong, if we violate our conscience, then we're sinning. Even though our conscience is not educated in the right way, we still are supposed to obey our conscience. Our conscience is what condemns us. Our conscience is what okays us. But our conscience has to be in tune with a standard. Remember, poor old Paul, he says concerning himself in Acts chapter 23, verse 1, I have lived in all good conscience before God this day. Was he lying? No. Well, wait a minute. Paul, what was you doing while you were living in all good conscience? He said, I was standing there while they stoned Stephen to death. Felt fine about it. Well, did it make it fine because your conscience didn't condemn you? No. It was the wrong thing to do. So your conscience has to come in line with the will of God before it can honestly be defended on. Man can experience heartfelt emotions. When's the last time you saw a dog who chased down a mother rabbit and then cried about making the rabbit's babies orphans? Doesn't happen. When's the last time you saw a horse that bucked off a human that was on its back and it said, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do that. I don't know what got a hold of me. I just started bucking. Doesn't happen. Next, man possesses a unique inherent religious inclination everywhere in the world, in every society. And even the atheist and the evolutionist must admit that man is going to worship something. That may be himself, but man has a natural inclination to worship, to realize that he's not the big dog on the planet, that there's somebody higher, more powerful, more knowledgeable than he is, if he's honest. That's natural. And then, of course, man bears the spiritual imprint of God due to him possessing a soul that's immortal. Once we are born, once we are conceived, we become a living soul. And that soul will continue forever and ever somewhere. And while we don't have the eternal on the front end of it like God does, then we do on the back end of it, because we will, our real self, our reality, not this physical thing that we're running around is, not this tent, but we will be somewhere forever. And so when you see the example here in Genesis chapter 3, verse 6, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and it was pleasant to the eyes and the tree desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit and ate, and she gave it to her husband with her, and he ate too. What do you call that? Well, that's the first sin. That's the first sin. Now, let's think about this for a minute. What are rules anyhow? If you were going to define for someone, and of course, use the example here, Genesis chapter 2 and Genesis chapter 3, that it seems to me that here God had certain specifications that he expected this man that he created in his own image and his wife, Eve, that he created out of Adam's rib, he expected something out of them. Well, obviously, rules simply means limits placed on what we're supposed to do. Well, what's the purpose of them? Why do we need rules? Do what? To stay on the right path. To define for us what the right path is what God expects us to do. And the reason behind that is it provides for us to have the most enjoyable life possible. The rules and the regulations that God has given us are for our own good. Now, when somebody is trying to incorporate that concept into an evolutionary system, it's impossible to do so. I mean, who decides what's for my good? And that's why we've got all types of philosophies that men live by, and terminology that's used to describe those philosophies. hedonism. I mean, hedonism says whatever makes you feel the best, do it. And there's a whole lot of hedonists in the world today. There's a whole lot of people in powerful positions who are running things in so many different ways that are hedonist. Whatever gives me pleasure, then that's what I need to do. That's hedonistic. There are many other philosophies that are based on this same notion. Yes, sir. Exactly.
Because they love it. They just want me to play in the road, go swimming before they're swim, you know. But I think God's the same way. The reason He gives us these rules, He loves us.
Exactly.
He says, some of these don't do some of these things. You get in trouble.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, why do teachers have rules in their classroom? You know, don't throw your book across the room and hit Johnny in the head. You know, why do you have that in there? Because Johnny's head needs to be protected. There's all types of, and we understand the restrictions that are placed on us by rules. What are the rules and the regulations relative to driving a vehicle in the state of Tennessee? And what's that for? Just to keep us from having fun? Just to keep us from being able to burn more gas in our car by going 14 times as much as we're supposed to go? Is it supposed to remove the pleasure that we get by living free and with our windows down? Or is it to protect everybody else from our foolishness and try to put restrictions on what we're able to do? And of course, when you see rules that are enacted like this, that means that the ones who are held responsible to those rules can obey them. No? We're not talking about individuals who can't understand. We're not talking about a person who's so mentally challenged they can't pass a driving test and thus they can't understand what 55 miles an hour means. They shouldn't be behind the wheel anyhow. They shouldn't be given a driver's license if they can't do that. So it's to keep us safe, it's to keep us healthy, and it's to keep us happy. Has mankind ever been wrong in what he determined was good and bad? Always. Always man's been wrong. I mean, Eve is the first example. I mean, how could something that looks so pretty, how could something that has to taste so good because it looks so good, how could something that would make me as wise as God, how could that be bad? Well, it's bad because God said it's a sin if you do what I told you not to do. And the way that Eve was tempted through the lust of the eye, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life is the three areas in which we are tempted to sin today. It's the only three areas available. It's the very same areas that Jesus was tempted by, as recorded in Matthew chapter 4 and Luke chapter 4. The same thing that John warns about in 1 John chapter 2, verse 15. Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that's in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but of the world. And the world passes away, and the lust thereof. But he that doeth the will of God, he abides forever. So every and any way that we're tempted to sin is in concert with the way Jesus was tempted to sin and in the way that Eve was tempted to sin. Everything we face fits into one of those three categories. Exactly.
She just knew what God had told her, what she could do and what she couldn't do. And her life was good in the garden.
In the garden.
Well, then one day Satan comes up to her. She had never been, I think she was real gullible, and I don't think she was thinking.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? I don't think she did that thinking almost sin against God. I don't think her thoughts got that far, probably because of how he was manipulating her, you know. But she learned a big lesson after that, didn't she?
Exactly.
So that teaches us to take a step back, and these are all given for our learning too, and not always be so dull. Because I've done that in my life. I believe I take people for their word, and then I shouldn't have. You know?
Yeah, exactly.
But it's a lesson in stepping back sometimes and looking at the picture clear, and maybe talking to somebody else. Maybe she talked to Adam and said, "This is what he's saying."
Yeah.
You know,
Wish that had happened, you know. We wish that they'd had a discussion about this thing. Adam, you know that snake thing? Here's what he told me. So they had a good conversation about it, and said, but that's not what happened. You know, she went ahead and jumped and took the lead and did something that's going to end up affecting her and her husband. And then he followed her lead, which is the opposite way it's supposed to be. He's supposed to be the head of the house. And so they both sin and get kicked out of the garden.
No, God understood that was going to happen.
Oh, yeah.
And so it was just Eve, it was just Adam, it was everyone else.
Exactly. And that's, we see ourselves right there. You know, there's an interesting statement that's made in Matthew chapter 23 where all these woes are being pronounced on the scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, whited sepulchres, snakes, kids, all that's what Jesus is calling the religious leaders of the Jews. And he says some of these people will say, well, if we'd have been there in the days of our fathers, we would have not done what they did. And then Jesus said, you don't know what you're talking about, because they killed the prophets, and you're fixing to kill me, the greatest prophet there ever was, so you're the spitting image of your forefather. You're doing the same thing. And so when we look back at Eve and say, what a dummy. How could anybody be so dumb? Then when we sin, we do just exactly what she did. If we'd have been there, we would have never had Johnson grass and thorns and thistles. Really? No, we would have, because we'd have went that direction. All right, God expects us to obey the rules. He's given us the ability to choose to obey the rules. And when we choose to disobey, there's consequence that goes along with it. And you know as well as I that that's one of the main problems in our society today, is the failure for there to be actual hurting consequences to disobeying the law. You can do ungodly stuff and get out of jail so that you can do it again in a couple of weeks. That's all over the world. There's no consequences. What is it called when you don't do what God says called sin? Now think about this. This is something that's oftentimes promoted too. Was human labor a part of the punishment that God initiated after the first sin? All right, so human labor was built into the arrangement of getting to live in the garden. It wasn't the real result of sin that caused them to have to labor. They were already laboring. They were already working. And I know there's a whole lot of people that like to make work, exertion of effort, as being sinful. You know, if it wasn't, we wouldn't have to do it. We could sit around and eat post toasties all the time if it hadn't been for Adam. No, they were given a job. They were to labor in dressing to keep in the garden before there was any such thing as sin. Adam was already tending and keeping the garden before that happened. The punishment, as Nick said, was after the sin. Then it's going to be a whole lot harder to grow a garden. It's going to be a whole lot harder because you have to deal with all of these weeds and all this stuff that's going to hinder you.
You know, you have to think about it. What Adam and Eve was doing in the garden before Satan, it was work, but it was pleasurable. When we work out in our yards or our garden, or we're tending to our nature, that can be very enjoyable.
Exactly. Because you're thinking about when you're working in the garden, you're seeing how I don't even want to think about last year, but you're seeing plants grow and not get eaten by animals and not get eaten by insects, and you know that it won't be long at all. If I take care of this, I'm going to be eating good old tomatoes right off these plants. And I mean, it's a joyful thing to engage in. Of course, it's not fun when you got weeds and thorns and you've got bugs and animals and everything else. But here's something to think about, and I never thought about it until I was preparing this and reading some of this extra material that's available at Apologetics Press. Was God's command that Adam and Eve not eat from the tree the only command he'd given them? No, that's not the case at all. They could have disobeyed God in a bunch of other ways as well. Now, you're going to look at all these examples that I've got here and say, yeah, but those are sins of omission. Well, they're still sins. When God says do something and you don't, what does the Bible refer to that as? Sin. When you break one of God's commands, that's sin. But when you don't do something that God commands, that's sin too. Which one's worse, a sin of omission or a sin of commission? They're both equally sinful. Therefore, if a man knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it's typical. No, to him it's sin. So here's some other ways. If Adam and Eve had not subdued and had dominion over the earth, they'd have been sinning. They would have been. If they'd been eating food that was not authorized for them to eat, that would have been sin. If they were not fruitful and multiplying to fill the earth, then that would have been sin. And keep in mind, that was the sin that resulted in the Tower of Babel situation, because they were given that responsibility to spread out, and they said, we're going to stay right here. Well, that's not bad. I mean, they were united in that. They enjoyed a wonderful unity of purpose there in Genesis chapter 11. But they didn't do what God told them to do. So that's sin. If they hadn't attended and kept the garden, that'd have been sin. If Adam had said, I ain't going to name these animals, well, that'd have been sin. If Adam failed to be the head of his home, which he did, that'd be sin too. So all of these are examples of other ways it was possible to sin in the beginning as well. If there's nothing wrong, if Eve was made with the ability to do just exactly what God told her to do, but she chose not to, then another question that sometimes arises that we'll spend about 5 minutes here thinking about. And this comes from a question that was asked to a fellow that I know by a young lady. She actually asked him this question. There is no doubt that humans want to sin. Why would a loving God that does not want us to sin create us with that desire? What an evil thing to do. Apparently he wants us to sin. How is that fair? Why would he expect us to not sin and then tempt us by giving us the desire to do it? That's sick. How could he be a loving God? Now, how would you respond to that? Sin is a choice, obviously. Now, here's the thing. Did God create us with the desire to sin? Well, of course not. Did God create us with the ability to sin, to choose to sin? Absolutely so. But he didn't make us sin. Every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own lust and enticed. No man can say he's tempted by the Father. The Father don't tempt anybody. Man sins when he chooses himself, and all have different desires. Now, is there pleasure in sinful activity sometimes? The problem is about all the time. Well, did God design us in such a way that some of the desires that we have can be fulfilled without sinning? Well, of course. Did God create man a sexual being? Yeah, sure did. Did he confine where those sexual relations are supposed to take place? Absolutely. What do you call it when you seek those desires outside of that place that God instituted for them to take place in the marriage bond? You call that sin. So the pleasure's there, but there is an outlet in which that pleasure is authorized. There's also an area in which that pleasure is not authorized. When something feels good, and that's our determination as to whether we want to do it or not, and not figuring into where did God allow that desire to be fulfilled. Is smelling cornbread and smelling beans on the oven, is that something that brings about desire? Anything wrong with that desire? Did God create us with a desire to feed ourselves and to think that food tastes good? Well, sure he did. But is there a limit to the satisfaction we're supposed to get from the food? You know, there's 47 pounds of potatoes. I love potatoes. Probably need to stop eating them, though, before I eat all of them. You know, so everything that God created us with a desire to do, there is an area in which that is authorized to enjoy the desire fulfilled. But outside of that, the Bible recognizes that it's sin. And sadly, we live in a world that doesn't understand that at all. You know, willpower, which is another characteristic that sets us apart from the animal world. Now, the animals sometimes, and of course, you know, it's like I've oftentimes thought back to the Bible characters who were traveling almost constantly. I dare say they did not sit down for 3 meals a day with their family, probably. You know, they're having to go from hither to yon to allow their herds to graze and all such as that. But when they sit down to eat, then they probably were not counting calories. They knew that if they ate like a pig and it was late in the day, they were going to feel miserable all night, obviously. But some of them didn't have any idea when they was going to get to eat next. So you have to balance it out there. We may not be able to eat for 2 or 3 days. I better really overeat a little bit right here. And the first part of the eating is wonderful. But then there's a point in which it's not wonderful anymore, you know. I do not think I have ever eaten till I was full. Now, I've overeaten a ton of times. But I've never got to the point where I couldn't eat something else, even if it was just Jell-O, you know. But is that smart? Is that using the desire for food and the taste of so good of food? Is that extended beyond authorized manner? Well, of course it is. See? So what we have to do is take care and make sure that we ourselves are seeking to find the fulfillment of those desires in the right place and not in unauthorized places, because then it is sinful. Is it sinful to get angry? No. We use the term righteous indignation. But we also see Paul warning us, don't let the sun go down on your wrath. He doesn't say don't ever become wrathful. He says don't let the sun go down your wrath. Do not stay mad all the time. Are there things that upset you? Well, certainly, and rightfully so. But you can only do what you can do and leave it to God ultimately, because vengeance belongs unto Him. Be angry and sin not. So, obviously, it's not a sin to be angry, but it is a sin to be angry to the point that you sin. And such is something that mankind has the capacity to do, but nothing else that God created has that capacity. Anything else?
Brother Freddie,
Yes, sir.
I was just thinking about what you said about eating too much. But
Don't think about that too much.
see, God gave us sight. He gave us taste. And we look at it, it looks good, it tastes good. That's the reason we overeat.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, you get in the habit of, after you get so much of it eaten, then you think it keeps on tasting good, but really, after a little while, of course, I don't know. You know, the 12th Krispy Kreme donut usually tastes just as good as the first one, you know.
They're rare. Usually your
Eyes
eyes are bigger than your stomach.
are bigger than your stomach, that's right. Thank y'all so much, and we'll continue on this study next Sunday.